Now, getting back into Bifrost, we're creating a scenario here that's a little bit more complicated, and it's to show the power of the Bifrost liquid system. So I've created another vessel, just like we'd used before. It has a protuberance in it, and this time we're going to create our fluid in a different way, and I want us to become familiar with a few principles that we can use here in Bifrost. I would like to fill this container with liquid. One of the worst things I could do, unless I need to do that for a visual reason, would be just to pour the liquid from a great height. One of the best things I could do is simply to create a polygon primitive cube, like so, and then scale it to fit within the parameters, or close therein, of my container here. So we're going to do like so, and then of course we need to make it narrower, and so let's scale it down this way. Now if I want a little bit of splashing, and I kind of do, I want to get a little bit, I can just drop it from maybe right here. I could even just start it right here, thicken this up a little bit. Nonetheless, remember that the primitive that we start with is what the fluid will be created from. So we're going to use this now as our emission object. With it selected, I'll go to Bifrost Fluids, create liquid, and I'll very nicely Control H to hide that cube. And here we'll start again. I always start at frame 1, like so. And let's rewind, and we'll play. And you can see, there we go, our simulation begins. And as usual, it will fall through. We need to select our Bifrost liquid, shift select our collision object, and in the Bifrost Fluids menu, we're going to say Create Collider. We're also going to create our kill plane while we're here. So again, I'll select my Bifrost liquid, and under Bifrost Fluids, we will create a kill plane. I'll position that kill plane right there is about perfect. That's good for me, kind of like so. And yes, I do scale it up. That's just for my own visual purposes to know that I have a kill plane there. But as I said before, the scale of the kill plane doesn't matter. It's considered to be infinite. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to rewind, and we'll play our simulation. And you can see that there's not really a whole lot happening here. And part of that is because the fluid doesn't really have anywhere to go. It's already inside of the container. You can see if we look really closely here that there's some disturbance going on. But the reason this is happening is, remember that Maya, although Maya's default is that for each of these grid units to be set to 1 centimeter, internally Bifrost consider these to be 1 meter. So we're looking at a fairly large pool-sized container here. So it's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, so about 22 meters wide, so close to 70 feet. What that means is we don't have enough resolution yet in our fluid simulation for it to kind of do what we need it to do. Now, under my emitter properties, I don't need to turn on continuous emission because we just want to use this fluid to fill this container. And so we only need it to emit once. However, I will need this fluid to have a higher resolution so that we can bump over here, so that we can actually get things to look the way we want. And so we'll go over. Let me remap one. Remember I showed you guys this under our liquid shape, under color, channel remap. I'm going to remap this to about 40 because we have so little movement in here that I'm going to remap this down to about 10 because we have so little movement in here. I do want to be able to see where things are moving. And so remember, these have no bearing on the simulation. They have no bearing on the render. They're simply visual approximations to help us kind of get a sense of what's going on. Next, I'll move over and we'll change our master voxel size. Let's go down to 0.3 to start. We won't go crazy. We'll back it up. And you can already see that we've got a lot more particles in here. I'll zoom out a little bit here. Let's hit play. And again, although it doesn't look like much is happening, if we switch to a wireframe view like on the side here, you can see that the fluid is actually falling into this space. It's just doing so pretty slowly. And again, the resolution is pretty low. So what I'm going to do here is, let's increase this resolution. Let's go to about 0.1. And yeah, let's give it a play. And as we increase this resolution, it's going to start to become more precise and more accurate. In other words, it'll start getting closer to the edges of its collision. And I'll show you what I mean. Let's switch here to our side view, and hopefully now you can see. We'll let it play in the side view. I know that's a little odd, but this is a great way for you to physically see what it's now doing. So as we build that resolution up, of course our simulation is getting slower. However, it's getting more accurate, and it can actually fill the space appropriately. Now I'm going to pause the video just for a second so I can let this run and do its thing. And we'll get back to it in a moment. So here we go, guys. I've let the simulation run for a bit, and you can see again here in the side view that it is simulating. It's subtle, but once again I've kind of scaled everything so that the water is not falling into this vessel with very much violence. You can see there's still going to be some upspray. What I'd like to do though is I want to stop this. I'd like to get this to a point where we could say, you know what, this is pretty good starting point for us. Maybe we'll let it run for another 10 or 12 frames. But then I'm going to choose this as its initial state, so to speak, just so that we can kind of get going with the tutorial. And so you can see they're rising up, and when the, with the inexorable laws of gravity, these particles will start to fall down. However, we don't have a kill plane in right now. We do want to put one. So I'm going to select these, and under Bifrost fluids, we're going to add our kill plane. And our kill plane is generally, right there underneath. And I know moving them and scaling them might feel good, but it doesn't do a whole heck of a lot as long as they're out here and none of these particles can fall past our perimeter. This kill plane is going to keep them in check. Now, let's pretend that I've let this simulate for a while and I like that it's starting state. At that point, I'm going to come up to Bifrost fluids after selecting this node, and we're going to come down to set initial state. Now, set the initial state, rewind, and this is where the simulation will start from now on. I'm going to back out a little bit. I find it's a little easier to get a read on everything kind of from back here. And now let's create something a little bit interesting. Let's create a polygon primitive platonic solid, which we're going to move up here. Let's give it a little bit of scale. Let's give it a little bit of bevel because we always want to make things look sweet. Right? Real nice. And then anytime I'm doing this sort of keyframing, I am going to disable right here our simulation. And that's just so that I can keyframe this without trying to keyframe this and having Maya simulate this all at one time. We're trying to keep it simple. But let's say up to frame 12 here, set a key. This particular object is doing nothing. And then let's say between frames 12, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So at 9 meters per second, it's going to take about 1 second and some change to move through this space, just like so. I have auto keying set on, so Maya is setting my secondary key for me. Let's just check that real quick, play through, and as you can see, it moves through space thusly. Now that I've got that set up, I can go and re-enable the liquid container properties so that it can simulate. We'll rewind, and then with the liquid selected, we're going to shift select our collision object, and under Bifrost fluids we're going to say add collider. And now hopefully we'll get a nice sort of very energetic collision between this collider and our filled reservoir of fluid. Now I'm going to pause for a second, and I'm going to let this get pretty close, and I'm going to start playing it back once we're kind of at the point where this object is touching our surface. Alright, I've brought us back to the point where we're making impact here. It took just a couple of seconds, but I don't want you guys to have to sit through that. However, I get this very weird pleasure out of sitting here and watching these simulations go. So this is another way for us to simulate an impact. This works in so many different ways with the Bifrost liquid system, but this is one that we've keyframed to impact at roughly 9.8 meters per second. In other words, we're giving this solid body the same velocity as normal terminal velocity with gravity, 9.8 meters per second. And so we've created a vessel, we filled it with our fluid, and after a few seconds or frames, or however many frames you need to let it get to the point where it sort of settles down the way you want, we set the initial state for it so that it's in a steady state, and then we have our object keyframed to impact into that fluid. Now remember, this is not something that we'll want to simulate over and over again. I want to get to the point where I've watched this, and it can be tedious, I do admit that, but I'll let it run in the background, and I'll keep an eye on it and make sure everything looks the way I want it to look. And once that is done, we are going to cache these frames out. One of the reasons we want to do that is I don't want to try to render this and simulate it at the same time. That's asking a lot of any computer, even a high resource system like my own. Certainly it's asking a lot of a laptop or, well, any computer. And we want to always err towards efficiency. So what we'll do is once we're satisfied with what we're seeing, and I am satisfied with what we're seeing, let's say for the moment, we'll rewind it back to the beginning of the simulation. We'll then go and select our Bifrost liquid, and it's always best to select it from your outliner if I'm being honest. And we'll go up to the Bifrost fluids menu, and down here under compute, we're going to compute and cache to disk. What that means is we're going to let it simulate and write each frame to the hard drive, and it'll be a sequence of .bif files. So I have my own cache directory that I generally put these guys into, right? So we're going to move this cache directory, and I'll show you where I put mine. So we'll open up my file browser. Here we go. 1 second, I'll pull that up. And so here in my file browser, I have within my hard drives, you can see that we've got a lot of hard drives on this system. It's a workstation designed for this sort of work that we're doing, so we do need a good bit of storage. But we do have a fluid cache folder. Within this fluid cache folder, I am going to create a new folder. I'll call it pool. And I'll generally delete this when we're done, but this is where pool is going to go. So we're going to, let me double click that, there we go. And so I'm just going to copy this path, and then we'll paste it in right here, Control V, paste. And I like to give the caches a name so that I'm not just dealing with defaults, and you'll see that the cache format is set to BIF. We're going to scroll down. I don't really want time slider for now. We're just going to cache 160 frames. So I'll set it to start end 1 to 160. And then we'll set the write mode to write all. Maybe in the future we can talk about what these other modes do. For now though, for what we want it to do, we just need to create this 160 frames. And now once we hit create, we're going to walk away, to be frank, because nothing is going to happen. It will be calculating and writing all of these frames to the hard drive in the background. So I'm going to pause it, let it do those calculations. We'll come back and talk about how we finish this off. Alright, and now the cache has been calculated. It does it in the background. You just sort of see these frames ticking by, but you don't really see anything happening on the screen, and that's by design. So I don't remember exactly how long it took. I think maybe the cache took about 20 minutes to run. This is a pretty dense Bifrost liquid here. I am on a high resource system. Nonetheless, caches sometimes just take some time. A lot of times I'll set it and forget it. I'll set the cache to, to calculate when I have other things to go and do and I don't really need to use the computer. But now that the cache has run, generally you can see that here in our Bifrost liquid properties, if we scroll all the way down and come down to the section called caching, open that up, you'll see that we have an initial state cache, which we set. And then we also have our liquid cache, and that is basically a frame by frame calculation. And let's open this up, see if we can just take a look at it so you guys can see. And so here you go, Bifrost liquid container 1, voxel liquid, and you'll see that each frame is calculated as a single file. And these add up. So I always tell people, make sure you've got some real estate there. You want to keep this, because if we look at the size of this cache, this is about 44.5 gigabytes of space that it's eaten up. So the reality is also, once I'm done with that, I delete these caches. You don't need to keep them forever unless you have some reason to do so. Again, this was a fairly long sim with a fairly dense voxel count, so it was going to create some bulk. I've got caches that are 500-600 gigabytes, 1.1 terabytes, but now when we hit play, you'll see that we're not simulating anymore. Maya is actually reading each frame from this cache directory. That also allows us to scrub, meaning I can jump just to, say, this frame right here, frame 60. And now when I want to render this scene, I no longer have to calculate it. Now we'll talk about rendering in the next video. For now, we have got ourselves a beautiful cached Bifrost simulation. Well, it might not be beautiful, but it's adequate. An adequately cached Bifrost simulation. Let me do this real quick. Let's stop the video for a second. I need to go and turn that off. Not you, that initial, there we go, turn that off. Now it looks a lot better. Now you guys can really kind of see what we're dealing with here. So let's back out a little bit. There we go. And so we have our nice Bifrost simulation. And Bifrost serves so many practical purposes. I think in a couple of videos from now, I would like to show you how to do the same process, not through the Bifrost Fluids menu, but through the Bifrost Graph Editor menu. It really is a better way of doing it. It is, I think, once you get over the node-based design of the Bifrost Graph Editor, it is a more efficient way of doing it, and the performance is quite a bit better. However, this looks pretty good. The only thing I might do at this point is, remember I remapped those values. I might push this back up to like 30 or 40 just so that I can, bring it back down to like 10, so that, there we go, so I can see these velocities a little bit better. Once again, remember, remapping these values has no impact on the render or the simulation. It simply allows me to visualize the velocity of voxels a little bit more easily. In fact, if I drop this number down to, say, 5, you'll see that we've got, boom, we can see the velocity of our voxels even more easily. So that is the finish of our Bifrost cache.
And until we talk about rendering, I'll see you guys later. Oh, and remember to smush on that like button.